Okay, Saving Private Ryan is a World War II genre film that was released in 1998. It does star Tom Hanks, who plays Captain Miller, Edward Burns playing Private Ribon, Vin Diesel as Private Caparzo, Tom Sizemore as Sergeant Horvath, Barry Pepper as Private Jackson, Jeremy Davies as Corporal Upham, Adam Goldberg as Private Mellish, and Giovanni Ribisi as the T4 medic Wade. Now, this particular movie is one that was one of the first World War II era movies that I had seen growing up, and really got me interested personally in World War II history and World War II era firearm collecting. So I thought that this would be a great one to look at, to both, for both history and movie buffs who are a fan of the film like I am, and as well as giving an idea of looking at the different World War II firearms that were used within the context of the film. Now, if you have not seen the movie, I definitely recommend you take a look, and also there are going to be a lot of spoilers here. So anyway, starting this off, let's take a look at the sidearm that was predominantly used in the World War II by the U.S. forces, and that is showcased here in the film. Now, this one is carried by Tom Hanks, Captain Miller, also by Sergeant Horvath, and by Private Jackson, Barry Pepper's character within the film. The 1911A1 was a standard issue sidearm issued to U.S. forces in World War II. Now, these did see service in World War I with the designation 1911, and then going into World War II, some alterations would be made, giving it the designation 1911A1. You know you're looking at an A1 pretty quickly with the parkerized finish, the keys fibrite brownish, it's like a tough resin or a sort of a hard rubberized plastic. I don't know exactly what they're made of, but the grip panels, a shorter trigger, a bulge mainspring housing here, standard 1911s had a flat mainspring housing. Those are some basically quick indicators that you're looking at an A1 and not a basic 1911. Now, it was chambered in 45 ACP using a detachable 7-round magazine, and it was, of course, as a 1911 is, a single action only sidearm. Now, these would be manufactured predominantly by Remington Rand, Colt, and Ithaca. Those would be the three mainline producers of the 1911A1, but they were also made by Union Switch and Signal and Singer to a much lesser extent. Now, in the movie Saving Private Ryan, of course, you see these being used by, as mentioned, Captain Miller, which would be pretty normal that an officer would carry a sidearm. Now, other countries like Germany would issue basically sidearms to who it may concern, or basically to anybody and everybody, as they were really more of a piece of a uniform, a status symbol more than anything. The United States military, you would typically see handguns issued out to officers, or basically anybody who had a job that did not require them carrying around a rifle. These would be people like maybe artillery crews, things like that. Now, in later production, the M1 Carbine would then take over and serve in this role, as we'll get into. But having these in the possession of Captain Miller, Sergeant Horvath, and somebody with a specialty role such as a designated marksman like Private Jackson in the film, of course, if he got into a close-in engagement, having a sidearm would be good. Handguns could be picked up and used by anybody, of course, at any time, but the movie, the accuracy, the depiction of the three people within the squad that this movie focuses on that would have the firearm was pretty accurately depicted. So anyway, there it is, the standard issue sidearm for the United States military in World War II, the 1911A1. Okay, now up next, let's talk about the primary firearm carried by Sergeant Horvath in the film, and that was the M1 Carbine. Now, the M1 Carbine was actually depicted pretty accurately in the film, as there are some subtle variational changes that did occur over the service life of this firearm. And number one, when it was first manufactured, it would be made by a multitude of different manufacturers. Inland Division of General Motors would be the primary manufacturer of this, producing the most. You had Winchester, you had Rock-Ola Jukebox manufacturer, you had Union Switch and Signal, Saginaw, Underwood, Irwin Peterson. The list really goes on. There was just a tremendous, I mean, basically if you look at the M1 Carbine, it really shows you the war effort, all the different manufacturers of different types of parts, equipment, or commercial goods that came together to make firearms such as this, the M1 Carbine. Now, in early production, you would find an M1 Carbine with a flip rear sight and with either a Type 1 or Type 2 barrel band, which did not have a bayonet lug. Now, the Type 2 sight, which would have it was a stamped and a gradual adjustment, That would actually come in at the very end of the war, World War II in 1945, and then the Type 3 a little bit after that. But most of the M1 carbines that you would see during the war would have the Type 1 flip sight, and again a Type 1 or Type 2 barrel band with no bayonet lug. Some World War II movies get this wrong, and you do see people with bayonet lugs and things like that, adjustable rear sights, and that would actually be incorrect for the time period. In the movie, in Saving Private Ryan, Sergeant Horvath's carbine looks pretty much exactly like this, even down to the magazine pouch here at the back, but he had the correct sights and correct bayonet lug, or barrel band, I'm sorry, on his rifle, or on his carbine, if you will. Now, the M1 carbine fed from a detachable 15-round box magazine, chambered in .30 carbine, which was a much smaller round, of course, than the standard issue cartridge, the 30-06, but was really intended to be used by personnel who did not have a mainline job of carrying around a rifle. So these would be cooks, mechanics, vehicle operators, mortar teams, anything like that. Now, you would say if you look at Sergeant Horvath in the movie, predominantly he was probably not issued out an M1 carbine, but what was pretty common at the time was because of their handy size and weight, typical M1 Garands, M1A1 Thompsons would be ditched in lieu of a M1A1 carbine like this, which is probably what happened with Sergeant Horvath, especially also because he's carrying a 1911A1, which is also considered a secondary sidearm, so a secondary firearm, if you will. So anyway, really cool firearm. This particular one, again, is made by Inland, has all early features, which is a early 2-rivet handguard here, early flip sights, flat bolt, high wood stock. So this has all the hallmark features of a standard World War II issue M1 carbine as seen in the film. And moving on from that was another variation of the M1 carbine that you see show up in the movie, being predominantly carried by their esteemed colleagues in the airborne, as they would say in the film. And that would be the M1A1 carbine, or the paratrooper version of the carbine. So here what we have, again, is a genuine M1A1 carbine that was in the second run of production, made in this particular one was made in 1945. So you will see it does have the Type 2 rear sight and the Type 2 barrel band, which would be correct for its time of production. So really only really late M1 carbines or M1A1 carbines you would see with these sights on it, as mentioned before. So likely this one may have not seen service in World War II, but it may have gone on to see service in Korea, but it was made during World War II. Now when it comes to M1A1 carbines, 100% of them were made by Inland. So if you ever do see one that's made by any one of the other Marriott contractors that I talked about, those would all be really fantasy guns, or where they took original M1 carbine receivers and maybe stuck them in original stocks. But for it to be correct, it's got to be an Inland receiver in the gun. Inland Overton made the stocks, but everything else, every other component would have been made by Inland for this firearm. And this one has also this one does not have a barrel date, which again indicates a very late manufacture. Now in the movie, again, you do see people from the Airborne 101st carrying around the M1A1 carbine. You see one in the first scene in the Rainy Village, and also at the very end of the movie. Most predominantly where you get the best look of this firearm is when he's using the barrel of it to prop open the hatch on the tank and they drop in a grenade. So anyway, you don't really see this carried by any of the main characters or the main cast members in the movie, but it does show up. And it's a good sort of a parallel or a comparison with the original version M1 carbine carried by Sergeant Horvath in the film. So again, it's kind of a big detail to get wrong if they had the airborne troops carrying around the fixed stock M1 carbines. So having them actually equipped with the side-folding M1A1 is an accurate detail. So anyway, there is the M1A1 carbine. Up next is the very iconic M1 Garand rifle, as carried by Mellish, Caparzo, and Upham in the movie Saving Private Ryan. Now, in the small unit that's flat heading through Europe, it would have been correct that most of the people in the squad would have been carrying the M1 Garand rifle, as this would serve as the base of fire. Now, not only those three characters are carrying this firearm in the movie, you do see it throughout the movie, and this was carried by both the Airborne and the Army, so, and even the Marines later on in the war in the Pacific, but this focuses in the European theater. Now, this is a 30-06 rifle. It is fed by a M-block clip holding 8 rounds. When your 8th round is expended, the clip will fly out of the action, giving it the iconic pinging noise, which you see all the time in the movie. Now, the M1 Garand was designed by John C. Garand It was adopted for service in 1937 and would go into production, but not really enough units were produced by the time the United States would get into the war in 1941 against Japan, so it would take a little while before these came in. But by the time the D-Day landings in 1944, there were plenty of these issued, and it was at the time the standard issue infantry rifle in World War II. As General Patton would say, it was the greatest battle implement ever devised, and giving a semi-automatic 30-06 rifle to every infantryman was actually a huge plus on the battlefield and created a huge volume of fire, as of course you see in the movie over and over again. Now this firearm has been popularized, of course, mainly because of movies like Saving Private Ryan and also all the video games that would ensue. So they would lead to a tremendous collector following on this rifle and really popularize it as an iconic World War II rifle, sort of the one that everybody wanted to have, especially here in the United States. Now these would be manufactured during World War II only by Springfield and Winchester. This one here is a Springfield. Now at the end of World War II in 1945, Winchester would cease production, but Springfield would keep up production for subsequent wars, which would be the Korean War and Vietnam as well. But anyway, that would make this the most popular and probably most collected firearm from the movie Saving Private Ryan. M1 Garand. Okay, next up is a fan favorite, and that is the weapon fielded by Private Jackson in the film, and that is a 1903A4 sniper rifle, or a designated marksman's rifle. Now, this is actually, the story of this rifle starts back in the World War I era with the 1903 Springfield, which is built on the Mauser action. Actually, a fun factoid here is while the Americans and Germans were shooting at each other on World War I, the Americans were paying the Mauser company a royalty because of the patent infringement on the Mauser action. It was a lesson learned in the Spanish-American War, as the Spanish were using Mauser actions and the Americans were using the Krag-Jorgensen. So of course they went back to the drawing board, came up with a copy of the Mauser action, which was the 1903 Springfield. Moving through World War I into World War II, some revisions were made to the rifle, namely the rear sight, which would have been found here in the 1903, was turned into an updated graduated rear sight back here, giving you a longer sight radius and more freedom of adjustment, if you will, more accurate adjustment here on the back of the sight. The military, especially the Marine Corps, liked having, really prided itself on accurate shooting, so the revisions were made, and you would see the 1903s and the 1903 A3s being fielded mainly in the early days of the Pacific. Now, when you have the 1903 action, in 1943, the United States decided that they wanted a designated marksman's rifle for the Army. Now, at the time, the Marines were using the 1903 with a universal scope attached to the top. Now, funny enough, the universal scope is also being used by Private Jackson in the film, but that was not necessarily accurate, especially the way it was mounted. Now, what you would have typically had on the rifle was the Lyman 330C scope, adopted by the military as the M73B1. Or the Lyman Alaskan scope. Now, Private Jackson also has the Lyman Alaskan scope on, so at the early parts of the beach landing, he's got the Lyman Alaskan, also at other various parts in the film. Now, in the scene when Caparzo gets shot by the sniper, and then Jackson does some counter-sniper operations there, you see him pull out a universal scope, and he mounts it right onto his rifle right then and there. Again, would not have really been accurate. It likely would have needed to be zeroed, and it's mounted right up here to the standard Redfield mount with two scope rings here. But the Lyman, actually, I'm sorry, the universal would have gone all the way out here with the scope ring here mounted to the top of the barrel through the handguard. So there would not have been a lot of stability there. You can see it when he's up in the church tower. You can see how much of that scope is hanging off to the front. There would be too much weight there and too much wobble. It would not have all been accurate. So not a really accurate portrayal. The scope that's on this actually is not correct for World War II either. After World War II, the United States would come up with the M84 scope, which was used on like the M1D and M1C Garand sniper rifles. So after arsenal overhauling, they would have taken off the 330C scope and put on something like this, which was just a little bit better. So this actually is a real 1903 A4, but had gone back for overhauling and ended up with an M84 scope on it. Now, like I mentioned, these would have gone to the Army. 1943 and 1944 produced only by Remington. So at Remington, they would gauge the bores, gauge the barrels, make sure that the accuracy standards were met, and then of course convert them into makeshift sniper rifles. These are really off-the-shelf components with the Redfield Junior mount and the 330C scope, which is like a 2.5 power optic. So really it was meant to give a little bit of a edge on the battlefield to the person using it, not at all used really for the intended purposes that they were really used in the film. This wasn't like a precision mile and halfway shooting rifle. It was really just a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a force multiplier, which was its real intended purpose when used. As mentioned again, this is a Remington made 1943 1903 A4. It is all correct. Now all the 1903 A4s were marked 1903 A3 on this side of the receiver, with the serial number on this side, of course clearing the scope mount. 5-round capacity. You would have had a swept bolt handle to clear the optic, which is correct on this one. Keys stock with a semi-pistol grip. The Arsenal Augusta Arsenal, which is where it went for overhaul, is stamped right here, as well as the original Inspector FJA ordnance wheel and all that. So yeah, really nice example of a 1903 A4, also used by Private Jackson in the film. Up next is Captain Miller. He is the one leading the squad throughout the movie, Saving Private Ryan, played by Tom Hanks, and is arguably the lead character of this movie. Now what he is carrying is an M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, which I have here. The Thompson submachine gun is an open bolt 45 ACP magazine fed submachine gun, which is fed from a detachable 30-round box magazine. Now, there were many different variations of the Thompson that were used throughout military service in World War II, starting off with the early 1928s, 1921As, things like that, with the cooling fins. They were very expensive and time-consuming to manufacture, so the military wanted to come out with something a little bit quicker to make, something a little bit more affordable. So they first came out with the M1. The M1 Thompson, actually what this was an M1 Thompson. The fire controls were a little bit different. You had little paddle type shifters. You have 2 selectors, one for safe and fire, and one for semi and fully automatic. So your 2 fire modes are there. So they were kind of like machined little toggle switches on the standard M1. It used a Lyman folding rear sight, or it wasn't a folding, but it was a stamped sheet metal folded piece of metal, which was back here with no protective ears on it. And the bolt was a little bit different. The bolt actually had a firing pin and a hammer mechanism. As the bolt would close, the little hammer on the back of the bolt would fall and pushing the firing pin into the back of the primer. They would further simplifying it by creating the M1A1. Again, this is an M1, but it was converted to an M1A1, so they would change the sight, again giving it these protective ears and a very simple peep rear sight and a front post. They would change the switches to these little stems, which this has. This was modified, giving it the more easily made selectors. And then the bolt, instead of having that complicated hammer and firing pin system, they just machined a simple firing pin fixed to the bolt face, again making the bolts easier to produce. This one actually still has its M1 bolt in it. I actually have a full-length video on this submachine gun if you want to go see it shooting, and more details on that, field stripping, whatever. Now, as accurately portrayed in the film, firearms like the Thompson submachine gun would be issued to commanding officers, NCOs. Things like that is they were more focused on commanding the element, and the sort of the advantage of a Thompson or something like this was to get a lot of lead in the air quickly, usually to get yourself out of a bad situation, especially at close ranges. You had other people within the squad, you know, your machine gunners, your BAR gunners, your riflemen, who could touch things out a little bit further. So if the NCO, the officer, the commanding officer, is getting engaged in the fight, typically they're up close, they need something to get them out of trouble, and it's a little bit more compact and easy to carry. Now, one other complaint about the Thompson submachine gun was its weight. It actually does weigh about as much as the M1 Garand rifle, so even though it is shorter and more compact, it does have a lot of hefty weight to it. This high comb on the stock does make it a little bit difficult to aim. Dumping a 45 ACP on a fully automatic through this is pretty controllable, but not as controllable as some other things that were made on the market. Now, towards the end of the war, they would come out with things like the M3 grease gun to replace the Thompson as standard issue, making it quicker and cheaper to manufacture. And by about the end of World War II, the M1A1 Thompson was officially phased out in favor of other things. Now, this would stay in the Ordnance Department, or this would stay in arsenals and still remain being used even through Vietnam, but the M3 grease gun, the M3A1 grease gun, would really take over as the primary issue submachine gun going forward. But anyway, this submachine gun, very popularized by the movie Saving Private Ryan and subsequent video games. Of course, everybody knows what this is. You can just see a silhouette of it and know if you're looking at a Thompson or an M1A1 Thompson. So really cool. Thompson submachine gun, open bolt. And this particular one actually is a transferable machine gun. It's not a SBR or a what I want to say, replica. So anyway, there you go. Okay, up next we have Rybin on the BAR. In the film Saving Private Ryan, Rybin is fielding a 1918A2 BAR. It is a fully automatic, gas-operated, magazine-fed 30-06 automatic rifle, and is really meant to be more of a squad or a light support weapon. A squad automatic rifle, if you will. It is not really meant to lay down the high volume sustained fire of something like a medium or a heavy machine gun or even a light machine gun, but it's really meant to be a force multiplier, a person within the squad to give a little bit of cover fire to other elements as they're trying to maneuver against the objective. Now, as accurately portrayed in the movie, you would have had a support gunner somewhere in your squad, and that would have been Ryben on the BAR. Ideally, you would have had a team with a 1919, but of course, just being a small squad of, I believe it was eight or nine, having the BAR as its support element would, of course, likely made sense. So that's what was used in the film. Now here again is a 1918A2 BAR. This one here is fully automatic, and it is an open bolt machine gun. It does fire on two modes, either fast fully automatic, which was about 800 rounds a minute, or a slow fully automatic, which is about 400 rounds a minute. Why they had two different modes, I don't know. Maybe meant for conserving fire. Now, the original 1918 BAR, which was used in World War I, did have a semi-automatic version. They would update it into the 1918A2 by changing a few things about this, namely putting on a worse sight, adding a very heavy bipod. So the revisions actually on this were not great. And really, for the day, this was not really a good viable firearm for the role it meant to fill compared to other things that were out. If you wanted to look at this as a light machine gun, it really wasn't, but if you compared it to other light machine guns like the Bren, which had a 30-round magazine, you know, the MG34 and MG42, which were flexible sort of medium machine guns. You had Japan with the Type 96. This was really an antiquated technology. Now in the film Saving Private Ryan, you see Ryben using this in sort of its intended role, mainly on the beach scene when he's providing covering fire for the guys trying to get around the bunker up to the hill, which then he provides cover for Jackson, who gets a sniper shot, you know, on the guys up in the machine gun nest shooting down at him. So that was a accurate portrayal of how this would have been employed to give support, suppressing fire to other elements as they tried to maneuver against the objective. So again, accurate use of this weapon in the film, at least in my limited opinion. So anyway, there is a 1918A2 BAR. Last but not least is the 1919A4 belt-fed 30 caliber machine gun. Now you saw this in the movie, used by Mellish and another guy from the airborne unit that they ran into in the very final scene, as they were set up on the A4 mount, sort of offset from a building. Also, they had one up in the bell tower that was, you know, working with Jackson as he was sniping the Germans from high places above. But anyway, what I have here is actually a 1919A6 configuration. I have a full-length video on this if you want to see it shooting and all that. This is a fully automatic. Again, the 1919 was a belt-fed machine gun. Now, the 1919A6, like you see here, was a stopgap in order to come out with a light machine gun, single-person maneuverable machine gun that was meant to create a higher volume of fire than was able to be produced by something like the BAR, but was more maneuverable like a BAR. So they came up with this sort of during the war as a quick stopgap. This was really like the original M249, if you will, or the M60. That's kind of where it all started. The fundamental principles of the machine gun are the exact same as you see them in the movie. Of course, the A4 would have been on the tripod that you see in the movie. You have a pistol grip here in the back, did not have the carry handle, and no bipod, with a different booster up here at the front. To make it the A6, they added the bipod, they added the carry handle, they added a shoulder stock, which I do not have on this right now, and the A6 flash hider and booster cone up here at the front. This is very heavy, weighing in at about 32 pounds. Very boxy design, very simple, John Moses Browning. As you saw it used in the film, it was really used in a defensive role. You would have mainly, you know, as the United States, both in the Pacific and the European theater, were mainly in an offensive role. The real use of this would be a suppressive fire, keeping the enemy's head down while your fire teams maneuver against the objective. Because it was belt fed, it could really lay down a high volume of fire as long as you were taking your time on the trigger, putting out short bursts, things like that, not overheating it. It wasn't a closed bolt, air-cooled machine gun. Getting away from the 1917A1, which is water-cooled, making this a little bit more maneuverable. So That's what we had, the United States had. And of course, you see it being used to good effect in the film. Because of the high volume of fire in the .30 caliber round, it did make it a formidable force, which again was portrayed accurately in the film. So very, very cool. Again, not used or carried by anybody within the main squad inside the movie, but was used towards the end of the film as they were trying to repel the against all odds, the big German attack on the bridge. So anyway, very cool to end this up with the 1919A4 or 1919A6 machine gun. All right, well, that's all I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, please let me know by hitting that like button. And if you want to see more content like this, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and bell notification button so you are aware when new content is coming out. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you off there. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV. I will see you next time.